So as you are embarking on your research, I wanted to make this video commentary for you, giving you some tips on how to best use books for research. So even though most of you probably won't be browsing the physical shelves at the Brooklyn College Library, say, you'll still come across some ebooks, and you would be wise, in fact, to seek out some books in whatever form you can find them, because sometimes you will find bits of information that are kind of hidden in books that don't immediately pop up in the search engine the way that articles about your topic do. So it's good to practice effective book digging skills, if you will, to not only find information that is not immediately apparent, but also to find it quickly and efficiently. And the beautiful thing about it is that the majority of nonfiction books that you might be using in your research, they come equipped with tools that can help you navigate them and find what you were looking for, and even better yet, it might help you find something that you want that you didn't even know you wanted, that you didn't even know you were looking for. So to that end, I have pulled up 3 examples that I want to quickly go through, go over, and look at some of those tools that can help you navigate those books and find some of their hidden secrets. Now, for the sake of time for this video, I'm not going to go through the database to show you how to find them. We'll be going over that aspect of it in class. The focus of this video is more about internal dynamics of the book, how you use the book when you actually have it in your hands, when you've already found it, or your digital hands, if you will. You probably won't be holding the book. Although, by all means, if you can get your hands on some physical books, that's the best yet, because that's where you find the really hidden information, is in physical books. That the information that's kind of hidden from the databases. But of course, we're living in the age of the plague, so I don't expect you to go to the library and actually find those books, although you certainly can. All right, so for the purposes of this commentary, let's say that I'm going to write a paper about Christina Rossetti's The Goblin Market, but I don't really have an argument yet. I don't really know what I want to say about Christina Rossetti and her poem, or her poetry even more generally. For the purposes of these examples, pretend that we're at the beginning of the research stage, before we even have an idea of what we're going to argue. We just want to see some of the kind of thoughts and ideas that are out there about our topic. So all three examples we'll be looking at here, we'll be looking for Christina Rossetti, and more specifically, thoughts on her poem, The Goblin Market, if we can find them. So the first book I found, I know that it speaks about Christina Rossetti because I found this book by entering in Christina Rossetti, her name, into the search engine. So I definitely know that she is in this one, that she's talked about in this book. Now, it's not a biography or anything like that, which if you type in an author's name, that will usually be the first thing that comes up, is probably a biography, but not always. This wasn't the first thing. This was, I think, maybe 4 or 5 down the list when I entered in Christina Rossetti into the search engine of the BC Library database. And this book is called Women's Poetry and Religion in Victorian England, Jewish Identity and Christian Culture by Cynthia Steinberg. So what I know immediately about this, just from looking at the cover, I know that, well, because of how I found it, I know that Rossetti is included in it, that there's commentary on Rossetti included in it. But I also know, just from looking at the cover, that it's not only about Rossetti. It's probably going to cover several different women poets from the Victorian era. Now, if I had a physical copy in my hand, the next thing that I would do is turn it over and look at the back, or open up, if it has the jacket on it, maybe open it up and look at those inside flaps that have the summary and talk about the book. So that's the next step, kind of scan that. and try to gauge what the broader aim of the book is, especially a book like this that's a work of criticism, and it's not. If what you're searching for is context, then you can look at the biography, and because this is a work of criticism, it's different from, say, a biography, where there's different kinds of biographies. Some are trying to just be factual and detail the events of an author's life. Some are what are called critical biographies, where they sort of interpret the author's life. Every work of biography is inherently interpretational on some level, but it's a question of degrees. But a work of criticism is very different. A work of criticism is going to be making a unifying argument, especially a work like this. It's making an argument that is unifying all of these poets together in some way under a general thesis. So you want to get some idea of what it's about, and the first thing to do in order to get there is to look at the back cover, look at the cover, look at the inside flaps, and see what those say. See what sort of thing you're holding in your hand or in your digital hands. Then the next thing to do, so with this, in this example, we already know that Rossetti is included in it. So we don't have to jump there. We don't have to make that the first thing we figure out in this example. We already know she's included in it. So what we want to figure out first with a book like this is, why is she included in it? What is that general thesis that is unifying these authors together, these poets? And that can give us some immediate idea of whether this book might be useful to the argument that we're trying to make in this pretend paper that we're trying to write. But of course, we're still early. As I said, in this pretend scenario, we're still early in the research process, and we don't even really have an argument yet. Nonetheless, it can be helpful to glance at the introduction first. So when you work with these ebooks and from the library database, you're going to have different formats depending on the platform, and you'll see the same ones over and over again. So this is ProQuest eBook Central, and it has a different way of navigating through the ebook than the other ones we'll be looking at, and some other ones that aren't included in this commentary. So to get an idea of the thesis, go right to the introduction. All right, and the key here is when you're at, especially if you have an argument, you want to quickly ascertain what the point of a book is. And whether or not it's relevant to your argument. But if you're at an earlier stage where you don't exactly have an argument, you still don't want to spend a whole lot of time reading the whole introduction in depth. What you want to do is get an idea of what it's about, so you can categorize it later and keep it somewhere in your mental file cabinet. Ideally, you'll have more than that, like a notebook or something where you're keeping track of everything. That would be the smart thing to do, but you don't want to necessarily go through and read the whole introduction right now. You want to skim it, right? You skim first, and then you can do a deep dive later, if need be. So just kind of read the first line. So we have this book is about the history of English literary criticism. It's not without its contradictions. So we're talking about contradictions in English English literary criticism. So we have it's doing maybe a rundown of the past 20 years of active feminist literary criticism, speaking to that in some way. So we have so we know right away that this book is somehow speaking to the feminist tradition of criticism. Okay, so that's helpful. We already know from the cover that this is focusing on women poets. So this seems like it might be important. In short, women poets who write on explicitly religious themes have most often been seen as passively regurgitating male religious traditions, which have often been categorized as repressive to women. Right? So lines like that are helpful. Even if you don't necessarily know what to do with that yet, you're getting some idea. It's speaking to religious traditions, male hierarchies within religious traditions. We have Milton. So we're going through here a bunch of prominent male poets. Oh, and look, here we go. So we see Christina Rossetti all of a sudden. Okay, so we know that she's not only included in the book, but she's mentioned in the introduction, and she's prominently featured. So she's wondering why Rossetti, who's writing in a religious strand, not unlike Milton, why is she treated different? So we see that Rossetti is still featured. So obviously she's a strong focus here. So we see her flowers connected to women. So it's talking about symbols related to femininity, religion. So we have feminism, religion included here, contrasting it with male poets in a similar context. Oh, and we see here it's speaking to Jewish identity, Jewish traditions. Rossetti is Christian, so we may not be entirely sure where it's going, but we know that this is somehow speaking to speaking across regions and how poetry crosses religious boundaries, perhaps in the Victorian era, right? Here we go. So here's something that looks like a thesis. So the writer of this book is saying, in this study, I realigned the discourses of gender, poetry, and religion to account for their historical specificity in the 19th century. So when you see a line like that, that's not necessarily the author's thesis yet, but it marks this as an important paragraph because this seems to be the author is trying to state her purpose in writing this book. So you might want to stop on this paragraph and read it a little bit more closely. In so doing, I acknowledge a number of important historical events and phenomena that are coincident with the construction of poetic and national identity in Victorian England, the emergence of women poets as enfranchised figures in mainstream literary culture, the growing presence of a Jewish community as an increasingly legitimated political entity, and the renewed attention to the Hebrew scriptures in the wake of the German higher criticism and the theories of Hebrew poetry generated in part by Johann Gottfried Herder and Bishop Lowth. These historical trends intersect with other larger ideological concerns in Victorian English culture, the increasing anxiety about the meaning of English Christian identity within an active imperialist regime, and the increasing anxiety about the status of women. Right, so we have a bit of a mouthful there, but you don't even need to don't even bother to linger on it and try to figure out entirely what it means. Just get an idea, just get an impression of what it means, right? And if you're going through the library or browsing through the database, just trying to quickly select books that you might use, that's really enough, right? We have enough of an idea here that we can file this book away, we can categorize it. Maybe we'll come back to it later, maybe we won't. But if your argument starts to develop into something about Rossetti and her relationship with religion, if you're writing about the Goblin Market as a religious allegory, or even if you're writing about Goblin Market and how it speaks to gender roles of the Victorian time or feminism more broadly, this book will probably be helpful, right? And for now, that's all we need to know. once we've ascertained that, then we can and definitely should go back and read it more closely, right? And actually figure out what it's saying, do a deep dive into it. Not only figure out what it's saying, but also start to analyze it and have a dialogue with this work of criticism, have a dialogue with this secondary source about your primary source of Christina Rossetti's The Goblin Market. And we see that Rossetti keeps coming up, right, as we continue to skim down the introduction. So she's obviously, and none of that, there's The Goblin Market, right? All right, so then we, at this point, I think we can safely say this book will probably be helpful to us at a later stage. So we might then go look at the chapters, the chapter headings, Christina Rossetti and the Hebraic goblins of the Jewish scriptures. Okay, duly noted. So there's a whole chapter devoted to her. We see that there's some other women poets. We see that they're dealing with monsters, and perhaps even religious monsters. All right, so that's great. So at this point, that's all you kind of need. Later, you'll go back and read it. But for now, we've gotten enough information. And we can set it aside. We can bookmark it, right? You might be able to save the PDF. You can download the chapter and save it to your computer. You can send a link to yourself. So always, 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 you really should keep a kind of diary, a research diary. Keep track of all the sources you come across. Even if you think it might not be useful, especially with something that has Christina Rossetti in this example, if it's something that has Christina Rossetti in the title, but it's definitely not helpful, you still want to mark it down to avoid at a later stage forgetting that it's not going to be helpful and looking at it again. You want to mark it down so that you don't come back and look at it again. And then if it's something that will be useful, then even more so do you want to mark it down and maybe make some notes. So if you were doing that in your research diary, for this one, you might want to put down, so write the title. So even if you don't send a link to yourself or a PDF, you can find it later. Write down the full title, the author's name, maybe even just the last name. And then you might just make some quick notes like feminism, Victorian age, Judeo-Christian traditions, and Victorian poetry, something like that. That would be enough. That's enough to mark it, to leave your road signs or your trail of breadcrumbs, if you will, whatever metaphor you want to use. And you can see, just looking at some other stuff like Cambridge studies, you know that this is a really valid source. It's it's heavily peer reviewed. These are prominent names, prominent critics who are editors for this book. So there you go. So then you can set it aside. You can come back to it later and actually read what you need to read. So, and that doesn't even mean that you have to come back and read the whole book later. What you might do is read the introduction more fully, more in depth, and get a better understanding of the overall thesis of the book. And then go to the chapter about Christina Rossetti and read that thoroughly. And then what you might do after that, when you're at that deeper reading stage, you might go to the index, scroll down, find Rossetti, and find where she's mentioned outside of the chapter that's about her, right? So we see, so from the table of contents, we know that the chapter 4, which has Christina Rossetti in the title of the chapter, is 40 pages from page 106 to page 146, right? So when you look at the index, then look at where she's mentioned outside of those pages. right? So 7 through 13, that's probably the introduction. But then on these page 28 and 9, page 28 and 29, she's mentioned 61, 66, right? So there's references to her sprinkled throughout. So don't limit yourself only to the chapter that's about her in a book like this. Go and find the other mentions too. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to read the whole other chapters where she's mentioned, but just read the paragraphs around it. Figure out why she's referencing these other parts. And if there's anything there that might be useful to you, and that wasn't so obvious from the beginning. And then the other really helpful tool that these books come equipped with is a bibliography, right? Never downplay the bibliography as a boring extra that's just required. It's a useful tool when you learn how to use it. Scan the bibliography, right? So you're at a stage where you don't necessarily know the direction you're going in at this stage, in this scenario. So just look at these other books. At least try to keep them in mind, but see if there's any other books that mention directly Christina Rossetti. There's one, right? So this is an old biography. For a paper like the one you're working on, for the most part, you probably want to avoid older books that are like 100 years old. Try to keep it within the last couple of decades for your secondary sources, simply because the secondary sources of the past few decades have already contended with these older biographies. So there might be exceptions to that, but you're writing a 7 to 10 page research paper, so it's best to just contend with more current scholarship on your topic. So this is from 99. This might be useful. That might be worth noting down. It looks like an anthology, perhaps. And I say that because it lists editors. So even though a lot of these don't exactly mention Christina Rossetti, depending on the direction your argument takes, some of these might still be useful, right? So you see nods to feminist theory, feminist social criticism and literary criticism. You see nods to religion, religious criticism, religious theory, and here we go, Christina Rossetti in context. So that's relatively recent, 1988. That might be helpful. So that might be worth noting down. This seems like it would be something that would be really helpful, even though it doesn't say Christina Rossetti in the title. She was a really prominent Victorian poet. So, and this is from a collegiate press. This would definitely be worth noting down and seeing if you can find it later. But you get the idea. So you have this giant map of, here we go, the achievement of Christina Rossetti that could be worth jotting down, making a note of to go back for later. All right, so you get the idea. It's on and on. She's got all these books listed. All right, and then we've got some articles, so on and so forth. So everything. So this is this can be really helpful in finding your next step, especially if it's a book that you found particularly helpful. So let's say that this book that we're looking at, Women's Poetry and Religion in Victorian England, Jewish Identity and Christian Culture, if this ended up being a really helpful book to you and providing you a lot of helpful commentary to reference and engage with in your own paper, then you most certainly want to look at the bibliography that this person used and explore it and see if it takes you in any other directions. Because this bibliography right? To a certain extent, you might consider it as these are all, think of it like a party or something, where all of these people are they're all participating, all of these books, all of these texts are participating in a single conversation, which you are now taking part in if you are writing about this same topic. So you want to see what everybody's saying as much as possible in the conversation. Obviously, for what you're doing for a 7 to 10 page research paper, you're certainly not going to be able to go through and read all of these books, but just see if you can quickly evaluate from the titles, see if it might be helpful, and also just take note. Always look at the bibliography, because if something keeps coming up again and again, let's say that everything you look at, in your research for Christina Rossetti, you keep seeing Christina Rossetti, A Divided Life by Georgina Battiscombe. If you see that, say, more than 3 times, then it's something you probably want to try to seek out if possible. Because if everybody's referencing it, then it's one of the key coordinates of the conversation, right? If everybody is speaking to Georgina Battiscombe, then you want to be sure that you are also speaking to Georgina Battiscombe and you are hearing what she's saying and referencing it, at least acknowledging it in your own paper. But of course, you're writing relatively short research papers, so you have to be selective. All right, so let's say you want to cast a wider net and not restrict yourself merely to books with Christina Rossetti in the title, or books that come up when you put, not just the first books that come up when you put Christina Rossetti into the search engine. So one of the ways to do that is to think about the context, right? We know that she's a Victorian poet. So this is a book that I found by entering, I think I entered Victorian era literature into the search engine. And a bunch of books came up, of course, because there's a bunch of books written about Victorian era literature. Loads and loads and loads and loads. Too many to even spend your time looking at the introduction, first and foremost, to see if Christina Rossetti is included in it. So what do you do in that case? Well, in that case, the first thing you want to do before you even bother looking at the reading the inside flaps or the back cover, if there's a summary, before you want to do that, just go right away to the back of the book. Go right away to the index. So I see if you had a physical book, this would be even clearer. So that's one of the one of many bad things about not having the library open, not having access to the library, because even though it might seem more arduous and more tedious, doing a physical search in the library shelves can actually be a lot quicker than doing it online. But we don't have that option right now, so we'll make the best with what we have. So go right to the index. Just skim it. See if you can find Rossetti's name. Alphabetical order, of course. So you're looking for Rossetti, not Christina. The last name will be listed first, and then the first name. We've gone too far. We've gone too far. We're in the S's. Where are we at? Where are we at? Here we go. So we find some mention of Christina Rossetti, and a lot of mention of Goblin Market. But you can see that each of these mentions, so here you might want to look at, it's about 6 pages where it talks about the Goblin Market, and then about 2 pages here. Right. So she doesn't feature really prominently in this book, but nonetheless it might still be helpful. So in this case, rather than going to the introduction, since she doesn't feature really prominently and the information about her or the commentary might be kind of sparse, rather than going to the introduction and seeing if the overall thesis is something you really need to engage with, go right to the mention of Christina Rossetti in the book, or in the Goblin Market, right? Goblin Market. So look at where it breaches several pages, where it goes across several pages. Rather than going to 201, go first to where it seems like there might be some actual discussion about it. Whereas 201, since it's only one page, it might just be mentioned in passing, and that's probably not the place to start trying to figure out if this book might be useful for you. Instead, go to 241 to 251, since that's the biggest patch of pages that talks about Goblin Market. And then you might look at 253, 55. But you can see it starts talking about, so it really talks about Rossetti from 243, and then it seems to go into her poem Goblin Market to 251. So go to 243, and you can see here in this platform, which is different from the last one, this is a JSTOR. You can see it lists the pages here. So we're looking for 243. There it is. Oh, look. She is mentioned prominently here. So let's have a look. Let's see what's going on. Oh, this is helpful. You have these sort of what seem to be the first few lines, right? Just go right to it. So there's a passage from one of her poems. So again, just kind of skim it. You can come back to it later and do a deep dive. What are we talking about here? We have self-renunciation, self-sacrifice. So these sound kind of like religious themes. So this again, it's talking about religion. Poet and woman. Victorian women's writing. Okay, and then here we get into Goblin Market. So in this scenario, that's what you're writing about. That's what we're writing about. So we have a bit of summary. You can kind of skip that because you've already read it. You know what it's about. Oh, and then boom. So it's somehow looking at this poem as a story of addiction, maybe an allegory of addiction. Okay, so note that down. And we kind of got that from the title of this section. Anyway, that it has something to do with addiction. All right, so it's comparing, from this, we can kind of skim this, see that it's Richard J. Walker is comparing Goblin Market to, it seems to be primarily vampire stories, looks like the Victorian vampire traditions. Okay, here we go again. It's reading it as a kind of vampire story in a way. All right, so at this point you can kind of stop. You can say, okay, so in your research diary, you can note the pages. So take note of the title and the author. Write down the page range of this. So 243 to 251, and you can just write something like addiction and religion. Write that down in your diary. That's what you would write down if you were doing this. So the title, the author, and then the broad points, the broad themes that Walker is dealing with. Addiction and religion, and maybe vampires. Maybe you end up doing a compare and contrast with Carmilla or something, which I think a couple of you actually are doing. So this would be, if you are writing about, if you're watching this video and you are in fact writing about Carmilla and comparing it to Goblin Market, then this might actually be something you'd want to look at. So jot that down: vampirism, vampires, religion, and addiction, and that's all you need. And then you can come back and actually read it later. Right now, you're just trying to gather your materials, trying to find trying to get the feel for the lay of the land, right? Just see the coordinates of your research, the bounds. Establish that, and then you can really analyze it thoroughly later. All right, and then this book I also found by typing into the search engine Victorian era literature, something along those lines. Again, we'll be talking in class more about how to actually find the books, but right now we're just focusing on the internal structure of the books. And you can see that changing the title of this book is changing the Victorian subject. It has several authors, relatively recent, within the last 10 years, so that's good. But nowhere in the title does it say anything about Christina Rossetti or the Goblin Market. So again, rather than going to the introduction and trying to skim the introduction and see if it says anything about Rossetti, instead, well, what you could do is go to the table of contents too. That's a quicker way than reading the introduction. See if there's any chapters devoted to Rossetti. So this looks like an introduction. Colonialism in Australia, that's probably not useful. Woman, Nation, and Empire. From this, just from these titles, that doesn't appear useful. A Tigress in the Desert, or a Tigress in the Paradise of Descent. That doesn't necessarily seem helpful. It seems like it's focused on another primary text. The Making of Barbara Bainton. So far, none of these seem particularly helpful. This might be helpful just as a general. This suggests that it's taking a wider general view of women artists in late Victorian writing. So that might possibly trigger an alarm that this might be helpful. Okay, so at this point we can say, well, nothing seems overtly helpful, but nonetheless, we can register that there's a possibility that it'll be helpful, right? So even though Rossetti isn't mentioned in any of the title chapters, don't put the book back on the shelf yet. Don't put it back on the digital shelf in this case. Instead, what you want to do, just to make sure that it's not helpful, go again to the index. Right, so you want to go if this chapter seems helpful, then it's just a hunch, right? So you don't want to go into that chapter and try to skim it even. You want to find out by going right to the index and seeing if it mentions her directly. Okay, so scroll down through the chapters. But what do you see? There's no index, right? That's because it's an anthology. A lot of times anthologies won't have an index. So the next step then, if there's no index and it's an anthology like this, so we've already ascertained that Rossetti isn't mentioned in any of the titles, but we had one possibility, right? Which one was it? The Woman and Artist, a Narrative Ends in Late Victorian Writing. This sounds like it might be helpful. We can see the first few lines here, the character of Elfrida. So it's talking about Sarah Jeanette Duncans, the daughter of today. So that's not super helpful right off the bat at this level. All right, so it's talking about a completely different work, and it's talking specifically about that rather than providing kind of broader overview. So nonetheless, you might skim it a little bit. You might go into that chapter and skim it, see if it says anything. And it doesn't seem immediately helpful. So go back and you might give it one last stab. You might give one more look to see if this book might be helpful before putting it back on the shelf. And to do that, this looks like an introduction. It's written by all of the editors. So you might want to just skim the introduction and see if Rossetti's name pops up, since there's no index. So we have, again, you don't need to read it, just skim it. Just look for Rossetti's name. It's not popping out, not popping out, not popping out. All right, so it's looking like maybe you'd want to take note of this book and possibly come back to it later, depending on where your research takes you. If you start making an argument about sort of general themes of Victorian era women poets, you probably won't be doing that exactly in a 7 to 10 page research paper. You need to keep it really tight and focused. But we don't see Goblin Market popping out anywhere. We don't see Christina Rossetti popping out anywhere. It seems like it's probably pretty safe to say that this book will not be helpful, at least not in the immediate future. So again, so what I'm doing here, I'm just sort of looking at first lines, letting my eyes roll over. I'm not really reading. I'm looking at the other names that pop up. So we see that this book, the essays included in this anthology, they're dealing with other writers. So I'm just looking for names. I'm just kind of reading first lines of paragraphs. Right. So this breaks down the book. This tells, so this is helpful. A lot of times anthology introductions will do this where they kind of give a little abstract for each of the essays in the anthology. And we can see, so we have the breakdown. Still don't see Rosetta's name anywhere. Still don't see it, still don't see it. So we have other authors, other titles, other authors, other titles. It's not looking too promising, right? We're getting farther and farther away from where we need to be for our research. And then finally, you can see that it ends in Peter Pan. You've already perused the essay headings, the chapter headings, if you will. And we can see that the last one is From Peter Pan to Proto-Modernism, the case of J.M. Barrie. So I think we've exhausted it. I think it's safe to say at this point that we can put this book back on the shelf, back on the digital shelf, right? So maybe take a quick note of the title, changing the Victorian subject, and then maybe just take a note, probably not useful, okay? And then you can put it back on the shelf and not worry about it, unless the only time you'd want to worry about it is if you notice that it kept coming up again and again and other things that you're researching. But more than likely, if you're pursuing Christina Rossetti and Goblin Market, even if you're comparing it to Carmilla or something like that, notice that in that introduction and all of those chapter headings, nowhere did we see anything about Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu or Carmilla. So we can shelve that book. So we have 2 winners, 1 not winner. They can't all be winners, right? And that's part of it. You're going to have a lot of misses. That's part of doing research. In compiling the books for this video, I had a lot more misses than I had winners, right? I probably went through about 10 different books before I found 2 winners and then 1 that I knew wasn't going to be a winner for the sake of demonstration. Right, so be prepared to miss a lot. That's part of research. Sometimes you go down a dead-end alleyway, right? And you have to turn back and reset your course. Sometimes you get lost. You have to find your way again. You have to grope your way back through the forest back to the path that you were on. That's part of it. It's a risky territory, research, and risky, dangerous territory, and many can happen. But if you stick with it, if you keep searching for that path, you will find your way in the end. You will find what you're looking for, and you'll find plenty of treasures that you didn't even know you wanted in the beginning.